and we were talking about the attendance issues in Year 8 in the Trust. Year 8 boys in this Trust, 3 secondary schools in the Trust, and why on Friday mornings was their attendance worse than the rest of the week. And the solution was that we know it's a problem and we'll measure it again in October. And that just my heart sinks when I hear that. When we talked a bit more about it, they had a 4+1 day, 4 periods in the morning, lunch, 1 period in the afternoon. Year 8 boys had French first lesson followed by triple science on a Friday morning. Now, I'm not making a judgment about French and science. I'm not making a judgment about how well or badly they were taught. But if you're going to have an attendance issue with white working class Year 8 boys on a Friday morning, have a look at the timetable, probably is one of the clues as to where that's going, particularly when you timetable across the Trust. So for me, the intersect between monitoring and delivery is where the real improvement takes place. So just to sum up before I hand over to Steve, the 3 things I hope I've got across to you is I want us to have a different rhetoric around school improvement. I want it to inform the way we think about strategic school improvement fund bids, for example, which are deliberately now, and I'm pleased I've been able to influence this bit, where MATs and teaching schools can no longer just apply to support schools in their own organisations. You have to work cross-border. The only way we'll sustain the system is if MATs and teaching schools work across more partners than they've ever done before. The SIF helps that with that. That's number one. The second one is capacity giving and taking. 21,000 schools gives us a massive potential of leaders and teachers that we can use to develop our system and accelerate it even further. £280 million is available in the next 2 years for the SIF fund. I have no idea whether we'll have a penny piece in 2 years' time for school improvement. So unless we build that capacity now to make sure that people are building the right partnerships that can sustain over time, where the right kind of governance structure is wrapped around it to ensure there is accountability for impact, then I worry that we'll miss an opportunity with that. And then the third message I hope I've communicated to you is let's be really clear about where schools are in the system, the improvement, the prevention, the intervention, and the action that we take around it. And if we get that bit right in the next year, 18 months, then I think we will change the school improvement landscape for the way we think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for a huge amount in there, and I know people will have a lot of questions. Steve.
Thank you. Good. Okay, before I start, pardon? I'm not the National Schools Commissioner, no. Okay. That's not true. Before I start, I want to say 2 things. First is, I think we're really lucky to have someone as talented and as principled as David Carter in the role that he has as National Schools Commissioner. I think it's very important that we have someone like David who understands what schools are about. And secondly, I want to say how proud I am to be involved in Birmingham Education Partnership, that it is, in my view, all about values and moral purpose and trying to do what's right for all the children in Birmingham. So just want to make those 2 comments before I start. I'm going to talk about principled leadership in challenging times. Because in April of this year, 3 security guards boarded a United Airlines plane, and they hauled physically a 69-year-old man from his seat. He was called Dr. Dow. They broke his nose, he had concussion, and he lost 2 front teeth. He had done nothing wrong. He was a paying customer. It's hard to think of what was going on in their heads that they thought it was the right thing to do that to an innocent man and treat him like a criminal. But actually, as a service industry, they should have been focusing on the needs of their customers. But in this case, their operational procedures won against the interests of the individual customer. It's outrageous. And do you know what their slogan is, what their mission is on their website? Fly the friendly skies. That's their mission. Right? But here they were acting totally against their mission in this case. It's difficult to imagine a greater gap between rhetoric and reality. But then I thought, in the organisation I was running, is there a gap between the rhetoric and reality in my own organisation? How much do we live the values that we talk about? And I think it's worth thinking about in your own organisation, your own mission statement, your own value statement. How much is it lived? How much is it practiced? How much of those behaviours are exhibited, especially by us as leaders? Or how much are they just words? And the last year or two, we've seen some pretty horrible political stuff and some pretty bad behaviour from some of our politicians, in particular the American president, who seems to like to make fun of disabled people. And when things are said that he doesn't agree with, he calls them fake news. And it's a troublesome situation. And I could talk about other examples, but he's an obvious one. And you wonder whether or not you should just say, well, that's politics, or even that's leadership. And the first sort of leadership manual ever written was in the early 16th century by Niccolo Machiavelli, called The Prince. And actually, this was reissued recently, and this was the blurb that came with the reissue. The Prince deals with many of the subjects which confront the modern manager and executive every day: how to manage hatred, contempt, and opposition, how to eliminate your enemies, successful deceit, and the need for cruelty, opportunism, and the careful use of brutality. Now, Machiavelli's big and radical idea was that you couldn't be a good person and a great leader, because great leaders have to do bad things. And if you don't do bad things, you'll be weak and you'll be eaten alive. And certainly some of the examples we've seen from some of our world leaders might reinforce that thinking. But although many of our politicians are not highly regarded, in fact, the trust between the public and our politicians is at an all-time low, that's not true of school leaders. On the whole, school leaders have the trust of our public. But we are seeing some signs, in some small number of cases, of behaviours that are challenging that. And I don't know whether you saw the Times Educational Supplement last year, charting the downfall of the famous 5 superheads. And I won't go into detail about these 5. All I'm saying is that they all came unstuck. One of them ended up in prison. For a time, they were all lauded by the Secretary of State. But they all lost their jobs. And it seems to me you start off with moral purpose, but in some cases, you cross a line. And that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. And I believe the pressure on school and on multi-academy trust leaders to cross an ethical line is greater than ever. Partly because of the high accountability and high autonomy in the system, partly because there's less of a middle tier in the system anymore, and partly because we're getting a time of austerity and a time of teacher shortages. This puts pressure on us in very important ways. Our high-stakes accountability system places pressure on school leaders to behave in a way that maximizes the performance of their own school, or MAT, but may not always be in the interests of the individual child in that school. Or maximize the performance of their own school, but may not be in the interest of other schools in the locality. And when you are fighting for the reputation of your school, and every single line of progress in learning is hard won, and in a system where falling below a floor target can cost you your job, you're under pressure to cross an ethical line. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about principled leadership in challenging times. And I think there are a number of dilemmas that we as school leaders are wrestling with. I'm going to mention some of them. I think you'll recognize these. Do I permanently exclude a child? He or she has been causing massive disruption, affecting the behavior of the other children. It's a serious, serious issue. I ought to exclude them, but I don't know what will happen to that child if I do exclude them, so do I give them another chance? That's a moral dilemma for a head teacher. At a time of austerity, do I accept a big pay rise from my board, when my staff are not going to get a big pay rise? It's a moral dilemma. Then another one. I visit another school, I see a great maths teacher or a great English teacher. I know I'm desperate for one in my school. Do I make them an offer they can't refuse in the hope that they come to my school, knowing that if they come, my school will get better and the school they're leaving will not? Moral dilemma. A school down the road gets into trouble. Do I keep my head down because I've got plenty of things to do in my own school? Or do I, as David has been talking about, offer to help? Maybe even lend them some staff. I want my school to be inclusive, but I know that by taking in more and more children from challenging environments, I'll probably do worse in the accountability system. So do I accept these children into my school, or do I do everything I can to resist it in order to do better against the performance tables? It's these dilemmas and others that we're wrestling with at this time. Now, the Nolan principles were introduced in 1995, which are about how leaders in the public sector should behave. And they're pretty good. Unless you're Machiavelli, you're going to support those principles. But I want to say that although they're great, I think that as individual leaders, they don't go far enough for us. Because I think we need to wrestle with these issues with our own conscience and in our own context. And that's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that we should be thinking hard about what's right, what we believe in, what our conscience says as leaders in this challenging environment. Just want to say two